Nora Whitaker pressed both hands flat against the old widow's kitchen table and closed her eyes so Maisie wouldn't see her shaking. 7 years she had survived without him. 7 years she had fed, worked, walked, and bled through Wyoming winters without a single word from the man who had left her carrying his child. And now he was standing 10 feet away in a dead woman's doorway, covered in trail dust, staring at her daughter's face like he'd just seen a ghost rise up from the frozen ground. Nora straightened her spine and stepped between them. She would not let this destroy everything she had built. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever loved someone who disappeared without explanation, if you've ever raised a child alone while the world called you reckless, if you've ever done something kind for someone who couldn't give you anything, back then this story was written for you. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and stay with us until the very end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The first thing people in Rawlins noticed about Nora Whitaker was not her face, though she was young and striking in the way that exhausted women sometimes are, a kind of beauty carved out by hard years rather than softened by easy ones. What they noticed first was the walking. Every afternoon without fail she walked. Not into town, not toward the mercantile or the church or the schoolhouse. She walked east, away from the cluster of wood-framed buildings and wagon-rutted roads that made up the town of Rawlins, Wyoming. In the early days when the wind came straight down off the mountains and didn't apologize for anything it knocked over on the way. She walked east, toward the isolated property that most people in town had quietly agreed to forget about. The Holloway Ranch sat nearly 2 miles out from the edge of town on land that had once been a working cattle operation and was now mostly memory. The fences still stood in most places. The barn still had 4 walls. But the cattle were gone, sold off years ago piece by piece, and the man who had built the place was long in the ground, and his widow, Beatrice Holloway, was 73 years old and alone, and too proud to admit to anyone in Rawlins that she could no longer manage to carry water from her own well without her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Nora had found out anyway. She had a talent for finding out the things people were trying to hide, not because she was nosy, but because she paid attention. She listened to the silences other people walked past. And the silence around Beatrice Holloway's name in the general store one afternoon had been loud enough to stop her cold. "Does anyone check on her?" Nora had asked the woman behind the counter, a plump, sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Garfield, who had an opinion about everything and a kindness budget that ran out somewhere around noon each day. Mrs. Garfield had looked at Nora the way people in Rawlins often looked at her, with that specific combination and written judgment that Nora had learned to read as fluently as she read English. Beatrice Holloway made her choices, Mrs. Garfield said. Her grandson went off years ago. Her husband's been dead near a decade. That woman's got land and a house and whatever pride she hasn't spent yet. She doesn't need checking on. But does anyone go? Nora asked again. Mrs. Garfield turned back to her inventory. That was answer enough. Nora had walked out to the Holloway place the following afternoon with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, 6-year-old Maisie holding her hand and asking questions the entire way, her small boots kicking up little clouds of frozen dirt. "Mama, where are we going? To visit someone. Do we know her?" "We're going to. What if she's mean? Then we'll be kind anyway and try again tomorrow." Maisie had considered this seriously. She was a child who took things seriously. She had dark eyes that watched the world with a steadiness that sometimes made Nora's chest ache, because those didn't come from Nora's side of the family. Nora knew exactly where Maisie had gotten that particular way of looking at the world, and for 6 years she had not let herself think about it any longer than necessary. Beatrice had opened the door before Nora could knock. The old woman was small and white-haired, and wearing an apron that had seen better decades, and she looked at Nora and Maisie on her porch without surprise, as if she'd been half expecting someone to eventually remember she existed. "I brought bread," Nora said. "I heard you might be able to use some company." Beatrice studied her for a moment. Then she looked down at Maisie. "How old are you, child?" "Almost 7. Mama says almost doesn't count, but I think it ought to." Something moved through the old woman's expression. Something Nora couldn't quite name at the time, a flicker of recognition, almost quickly smoothed over. "Come in then," Beatrice said. "Both of you." That was how it started. What began as a single afternoon stretched into a week, then a month, then a season. Nora came every day that the weather allowed, and on several days that it didn't. She brought what she could from the meager surplus of her own pantry. She swept floors and mended curtains and carried water and chopped vegetables, while Maisie sat at Beatrice's kitchen table, doing her letters in an old notebook or asking the old woman questions that Beatrice answered with surprising patience. "Did you love your husband when you married him?" "Eventually." "But not right away. He had to earn it, did he?" "He did." Maisie had thought about this. "Mama says love isn't something you fall into. She says it's something you build." Beatrice had glanced toward Nora at that. "Your mother is wiser than her years," the old woman said carefully. Nora pretended she hadn't heard. The town had opinions about all of this, naturally. People in small Wyoming towns in that era always had opinions about women who didn't fit neatly into the expected shape. Nora Whitaker was too young to be this poor, and too pretty to be this alone, and too stubborn to be this good-natured about it. And people found that combination unsettling, in the way that anything honest tends to unsettle people who have made peace with comfortable untruths. She was working 3 jobs, taking in laundry, helping at the seamstress's shop 2 afternoons a week, and doing whatever household work she could find from families who needed an extra pair of hands but didn't want to pay too much for them. She lived in a 2-room house on the west end of town that was cold in the mornings and draughty at night and not much in between, and she had been making that work for 6 years with a kind of grim, practical determination that doesn't leave much room for self-pity. She didn't talk about Maisie's father. When people asked, and they asked, because they always asked, she gave them nothing. "She has a father," Nora would say. "And where is he?" "Gone." "Gone how?" "Just gone." After the first year or 2, most people stopped pressing. The ones who hadn't stopped were the ones Nora had learned to smile at in a way that communicated clearly that the conversation was over. It was a skill she had developed out of necessity. Necessity had given her a great many skills she'd never asked for. What she didn't tell anyone, what she hadn't told a living soul, was the whole truth. She hadn't told anyone that Calder Boone had left Wyoming 7 years ago, with promises that she had believed completely. She hadn't told anyone that he had kissed her goodbye in the gray light before dawn and told her he'd come back with enough money to build something real, something permanent, something that would last longer than the winter. She hadn't told anyone that she had waited, that she had written letters and received nothing, that she had sent word through every person she could find who traveled between Wyoming and the cattle routes in the south and west, and that none of them had brought anything back. That she had finally, after Maisie was 3 months old and she was surviving on stubbornness and not much else, accepted the only explanation that seemed to make sense. He wasn't coming back. She didn't know why. She had eventually stopped trying to understand why. What mattered was Maisie, and what mattered for Maisie was getting through each day intact, and that was what Nora focused on with everything she had. She did not let herself grieve what she couldn't explain. She did not let herself hope for what hadn't come. And she did not ever allow herself to look at Maisie's dark eyes for too long in the firelight. It was the 3rd week of November when everything changed. The day had started like any other. Nora had dropped Maisie at the schoolhouse, taken in 2 loads of laundry, argued politely with Mrs. Garfield about the price of flour, collected Maisie again, and walked the 2 miles east toward Beatrice's ranch with a small parcel of medicine she'd traded half a morning's work to obtain from the doctor's office. Beatrice had been coughing more than usual. The cold was settling into the old woman's chest in a way that Nora didn't like, and she had decided, without being asked, that something needed to be done about it. The wind had teeth that afternoon. It came in low and steady from the northwest and found every gap in Nora's coat and didn't apologize. Maisie walked with her chin down and her eyes squinted against the gust, holding Nora's hand with both of her own, still somehow managing to talk. "Mrs. Holloway told me her husband built the whole barn himself," Maisie said. She said it took him 2 full summers. That's a long time. She said he wasn't very fast, but he was very careful. She said he checked every board twice. A pause. "Do careful people take longer than fast people?" "Almost always. Is that good or bad? Depends on what you're building." Maisie thought about this in the particular way she had, turning it over in her mind like a stone she was checking for interesting markings on the underside. "I think I'm a careful person," she announced finally. "I think you're right," Nora agreed. The Holloway ranch was quiet when they arrived. The horses in the near paddock were restless, which meant the wind had been disturbing them, and Nora made a mental note to check that the paddock gate was properly latched before they left for the evening. Beatrice couldn't be running after loose horses in weather like this. She knocked twice and opened the door. Beatrice had stopped insisting on formal knocking after the 3rd week and called into the warm interior. "Beatrice, it's us. I've got the medicine from Dr. Calloway." "Kitchen," came the old woman's voice, smaller than usual. Nora moved through to the kitchen, with Maisie close behind her. Beatrice was at the table, wrapped in a shawl, her hands curled around a cup of something warm, her eyes doing something unusual. She was not looking at the window or the stove or the door. She was looking at something far away. "Are you all right?" Nora asked, setting down her bag and moving to check the stove. "Better than I deserve," Beatrice said, which was not an answer to the question Nora had asked. Nora let it pass. She had learned not to push Beatrice when the old woman went quiet in that particular way. There were rooms inside people that you didn't walk into uninvited, and Beatrice had several that Nora had simply learned to leave closed. She got the soup going and set Maisie at the table, with her notebook and a bit of charcoal for drawing. And she moved through the kitchen, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned this space the way she had learned her own, by being in it every day until it told her where everything lived. The afternoon had gone gray, and the wind had gotten louder. Maisie was drawing something. She had been going through a phase of drawing horses, which Beatrice encouraged by periodically commenting on them with the seriousness of an art critic. "The legs are better," Beatrice observed, leaning over to look. "I counted their legs this time," Maisie said. 4 is a lot of legs." "It is. Bugs have 6. I did. I think 6 legs would be exhausting." Nora was stirring the soup and listening with the part of her that was always listening, the part that never fully rested. And she was also noticing that the wind had gone up another register, and the light outside the kitchen window had taken on that particular flat gray quality that meant the temperature was dropping seriously. She glanced toward Beatrice. The old woman was looking at the front window now. Her expression had done something Nora had never seen it do. It had gone frightened, not worried, not concerned. Frightened in the way that people look frightened when something they have been dreading for a very long time has just become visible on the horizon. "Beatrice, someone's coming," the old woman said quietly. Nora turned toward the window. Through the gray afternoon, she could see distantly the shape of a rider moving along the road that led in from the south. A single horse, moving steadily, not fast. The kind of riding that meant someone who knew where they were going and was in no particular hurry about arriving. "Are you expecting someone?" Nora asked. Beatrice didn't answer. The sound of hooves grew until it stopped somewhere near the front of the house. Then there was the particular silence that follows a horse being reined in, and then footsteps on the porch boards, and then the knock. Not a gentle knock, a decisive one, knuckles solid against the old wood, the knock of a man accustomed to knocking on doors that didn't always open easily. "I'll get it," Nora said. Beatrice's hand came up. "Wait." Nora stopped. The old woman rose from her chair, and she moved toward the front of the house with a slowness that had nothing to do with her bad knee. She moved like someone approaching something she had spent a long time preparing herself to approach. And then she opened the door. The wind came in, first a cold, hard gust that stirred the papers on the small table near the entrance and sent a curl of warmth from the kitchen out into the gray afternoon. The man on the porch was tall. Nora registered that first, the way a woman registers threats, not with drama, just with the quiet, efficient assessment of someone who has learned to notice things quickly. Tall, with the kind of build that came from years of outdoor work rather than anything intentional. His coat was brown leather, aged to a color somewhere between caramel and dust, and it was covered in the pale grime of long road travel. His hat was dark and pushed back slightly on his head. His jaw was dark with several days of growth. His eyes moved past Beatrice and landed on Nora. The room went very still. Later, Nora would try to reconstruct what happened in those first seconds, what she recognized, in what order, and at what cost. She would not be entirely successful. What she remembered was this, the specific quality of the silence in the room. The way the spoon in her hand suddenly felt very heavy. The way Maisie, who had been drawing quietly, went still at the table as if she too had registered something change in the air, something she couldn't name but could feel. She recognized his eyes before she recognized anything else about him. She had spent years trying to forget the particular way he looked at things, the directness of it. The way his attention landed on whatever he was looking at, with a weight that made you feel seen in a way that was sometimes wonderful and sometimes like being caught. Her hand loosened. The spoon dropped against the side of the pot. Nora. He said her name like he wasn't sure it was the right word for what he was seeing. Like he was using it carefully, the way you use something you'd believed was broken and weren't sure would hold. She could not speak. She stood in Beatrice Holloway's kitchen and looked at Calder Boone and felt something move through her that she refused, even then, to name. 7 years. 7 years of work and cold mornings and Maisie's dark eyes and 3 jobs and the particular exhaustion of being a woman that nobody fully believed in. 7 years of not knowing. 7 years of making peace badly with not knowing. 7 years of building a life around an absence and telling herself that the absence was permanent and that was all right. That was all right. It had to be all right. And now he was standing in this kitchen, looking at her. And then his eyes moved to the left, to the table. To Maisie, who had set down her charcoal and turned in her chair and was looking at this strange man with the calm, careful eyes that Nora had never quite been able to stop seeing his face in. The air went out of the room. Calder's gaze moved between the child's face and Nora's, and then back to the child's face, and something happened behind his eyes, a slow, terrible mathematics, the kind that couldn't be undone once it started. Nora moved. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put herself between Calder and her daughter, with a quickness that was pure instinct, the instinct of an animal protecting something irreplaceable. And she stood there with her spine straight, and her chin up, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. "Get your coat, Maisie," she said. Her voice came out level. She did not know how. "Now, sweetheart." Coat. Maisie heard the particular frequency in her mother's voice that meant this was not negotiable, and she slid off her chair and went to the hook by the door without another word, casting one last curious glance at the man in the doorway. "You don't have to leave," Beatrice said quietly, from somewhere behind her. "We do," Nora said. Nora. Calder's voice again, still with that careful quality. Still with that weight she'd spent 7 years trying to forget the feel of. "We need to talk." "We don't. You know who I am." "I know exactly who you are." She turned to look at him then, because she refused to do this with her back to him, refused to let him think she was afraid. She looked him full in the face and used every year of practice she had at keeping her voice and expression exactly where she wanted them. "And I need you to step aside so I can take my daughter home." Something moved through his face, something complicated and heavy. But he didn't move. He stopped, swallowed. "Try it again. How old is she?" "That's not a question I'm answering tonight." "Move," she said quietly. "Please." He moved. She took Maisie's hand and walked past him, through the door, out onto the porch where the cold hit her like something physical and welcome. She kept her hand in Maisie's, and kept her stride even, and kept her eyes on the road east that would take them back to town, and she did not look back. "Mama," Maisie said, after they had gone 20 yards, "who was that man?" "Someone from a long time ago. Did you know him?" "Yes. Does he know you?" Nora kept walking. "He used to," she said. The road was frozen, and the wind was picking up, and the light was going fast. Nora walked with her eyes forward, and her daughter's hand warm in hers, and the particular cold that had nothing to do with weather moving through her chest. Behind her, she knew Beatrice's door was still open. She knew Beatrice was still watching. She had not missed the look on the old woman's face when Calder had walked through that door, not surprise, but the carefully arranged expression of someone watching a thing unfold that they had known was going to unfold and had been unable to stop. There would be a conversation about that later, but not tonight. Tonight she had to get Maisie home, and get her fed and get her to bed, and then she had to sit by herself in the cold kitchen of her small house and figure out what she was going to do with a past that had just ridden back into her life on a dust-covered horse like it had every right to be there. She walked. She was halfway back to town when it started to snow. Not the soft, gentle snow that sometimes fell in November before the real cold arrived. This was the other kind, hard, sideways snow driven by the northwest wind, the kind that meant serious business, the kind that the old-timers in Rawlins watched, come in and shook their heads at, because they knew what came behind it. Nora looked at the sky, looked at Maisie. Her daughter was 6 years old, and wearing a coat that was good but not built for what was coming, and the road back to town was still 1.5 miles away, and the light was going. She looked back at the Holloway ranch, the warm rectangle of light from Beatrice's window. "You're thinking about going back," Maisie said. It wasn't a question. "Don't be smart." "I'm not being smart. I just know how you look when you're thinking that way." Nora looked at her daughter's face, at those dark, watchful eyes. "If we go back," she said carefully, "you need to stay close to me and not ask a lot of questions." "I'm not going to promise that," Maisie said honestly. "Nora, almost," she said. "Come on." They turned around. The Holloway ranch received them back without ceremony. Beatrice opened the door before they knocked, looked at the sky behind them, and stepped aside without comment, which was exactly the right thing to do. Calder was standing by the fireplace. He had taken his coat off. He looked bigger without it somehow. Or maybe that was just because Nora was more aware of him now, the way you become more aware of something once you've turned your back on it and then had to face it again. He watched her come in. He didn't say anything. Beatrice took Maisie's coat and handed the child a quilt and a cup of warm milk and directed her toward the armchair by the fire with the quiet authority of a woman who had managed children in difficult situations for 7 decades and knew that the best thing you could do in a tense room was give the youngest person in it something warm and something to do. Maisie settled into the armchair and pulled the quilt up to her chin and watched everything with those eyes. Nora stood on the opposite side of the room from Calder. She looked at Beatrice. You knew he was coming. Beatrice did not insult her by pretending. "I suspected," the old woman said carefully. "He'd written to say he might make his way back this winter. I didn't know when. You might have mentioned that. I didn't know how." Nora pressed her lips together. There was more to say about this. Considerably more. But this was not the moment, and Maisie's ears were in the room, so she set it aside. She looked at Calder. He was watching her with an expression. She couldn't fully read something between guilt and the kind of careful, restrained attention that meant he was very deliberately not doing something he wanted to do. Not reaching for her, not moving toward her, standing where he was and giving her the space of the room. "You can sleep in the barn," she said, "tonight." His eyebrows moved slightly. "The storm has walls," she said, "and it's dry." A long pause. "Yes," he said. "I have." He reached for his coat. "Supper first," Beatrice said firmly in the voice of a woman who intended to be obeyed. Nobody sleeps in my barn on an empty stomach, not even deserving ones. It was, Nora thought, a pointed word choice. Beatrice looked very deliberately at nothing while making it. They ate supper with Maisie chattering about the horses she'd seen in the paddock and asking Calder questions about cattle trails, because he had that particular look of a man who had been somewhere interesting, and Maisie had a nose for people who had been places. Calder answered her carefully, watching the child with an expression that Nora found unbearable and forced herself to keep looking at anyway, because she had made a decision, long ago, that she was not going to be a woman who looked away from things. He was looking at Maisie the way a man looks at something he's trying to memorize. The way a man looks at something he suspects he's already missed. Nora watched him look, and her soup went cold in the bowl, and she did not eat much of it. After the dishes were cleared and Maisie was yawning into the back of her hand, Beatrice showed Calder to the door and handed him 2 blankets and a lamp with a quiet word that Nora didn't hear. And then the door closed behind him, and the sound of his footsteps across the porch faded into the rising noise of the storm. Beatrice turned. She looked at Nora with the expression of a woman who had a great deal to say and was choosing, very deliberately, where to begin. Nora met her eyes. "Not tonight," Nora said quietly. Beatrice looked at Maisie, asleep in the armchair, with the quilt pulled up to her ears, her charcoal drawings scattered on the floor around her. "No," the old woman agreed. "Not tonight." But the walls of the old ranch house were thin, and the storm was loud, and both of them knew that tonight was just the front end of something that was going to have to be faced eventually. That was the particular cruelty of small spaces and bad weather. They didn't let you keep avoiding the things you'd gotten very good at avoiding. Nora lay awake in Beatrice's spare room for a long time, listening to the storm and looking at the ceiling, and thinking about a morning 7 years ago, when a young man had kissed her goodbye in the gray light before dawn. She had believed him. That was the thing that still lived underneath everything else. Underneath the anger and the practical hard-built life she had made without him. She had believed him completely, with the particular totality of someone who had never been given a reason not to. And he had not come back. She turned on her side. Maisie was breathing softly in the cot across the room, her dark lashes still against her cheek. Nora looked at her daughter's face in the thin moonlight that came through the window between gusts of snow. 7 years, she thought. He had a lot to answer for. And tomorrow, whether she wanted it or not, the storm was going to make sure there was nowhere left to go. Nora woke before dawn, not because Maisie stirred, and not because the storm had let up, it hadn't. She woke because some part of her body had decided that sleep was a luxury she no longer had the right to, and pulled her up out of it with the blunt efficiency of a hand gripping a collar. She lay still for a moment, listening. The wind was still working at the walls. The house made the sounds old houses make in serious weather, a low, periodic groan from the roof timbers, the soft percussion of something loose rattling at irregular intervals somewhere outside. Maisie was a small, still shape in the cot across the room, breathing evenly, one hand open beside her cheek. She slept since she was an infant. Nora got up without making noise. She dressed in the dark, laced her boots by feel, and went into the kitchen. Beatrice was already there. The old woman was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup, not drinking, just holding. She looked up when Nora came in but didn't say anything. This was one of the things Nora had come to value most about Beatrice Holloway. The woman understood that silence between people who trusted each other was not a problem requiring solution. Nora put more wood in the stove, filled the kettle, and set it to heat. Then she sat down across from Beatrice and looked at her hands on the table. "How long have you known?" she asked. Beatrice set down her cup. "That you were the woman my grandson loved." The old woman was quiet for a moment. "Since the 2nd week you came." Nora looked up. "He wrote me letters," Beatrice said. "Over the years. He didn't write much. Calder never was a man who used words easily, but he wrote enough. He told me her name once. Said he'd loved a woman named Nora Whitaker before he left Wyoming, that it had ended badly, that he didn't want to say more than that, The old woman's eyes moved toward the room where Maisie was sleeping. When that child walked through my door the first day, I counted backward. And then I looked at her eyes. The kettle began to whisper. You could have told me, Nora said. Her voice came out very flat. She was working to keep it that way. I could have, Beatrice agreed. But to what end? Calder was somewhere in New Mexico territory at the time, working another man's cattle. You had a life you were building. Maisie was doing fine. A pause. I was afraid of what knowing would do to you. That wasn't your decision to make. No, Beatrice said quietly. It wasn't. The admission sat between them, honest and a little painful. Nora got up and poured the water and brought back 2 cups and sat down again. Outside, the wind hit the side of the house with a sound like a door slamming. He's not the man who left, Beatrice said. I want you to know that. Not because it changes what you went through. It doesn't. But because you're going to have to be in the same house as him for however long this storm runs, and I think it's better if you know it. People say that about men who've done damage, Nora said. He's changed. He's different now. Give him a chance. She wrapped both hands around her cup. It usually means they've gotten better at hiding it. That's not what I mean. I know it's not what you mean. She drank. I also know you love him. And I know that means you're not an impartial witness. Beatrice almost smiled. No, I'm not. Nora looked at the window. What happened to him? She asked, and hated herself slightly for asking, because she'd spent 6 years constructing a very effective wall around that question, and she could feel it cracking in real time. He went south looking for work on the cattle drives, Beatrice said. He wrote me that he'd sent letters to you and got nothing back. Then he wrote that he'd sent word through your father and received a message in return that. The old woman stopped. That what? Beatrice looked at her steadily. That you and the baby had both died. The kitchen went absolutely still. Nora heard the word the way you hear something that doesn't make sense, yet registering the sounds but not their arrangement. He was told I died, she said, yes, by my father. Beatrice said nothing. Nora set down her cup. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table to stop it and stared at the grain of the wood because looking at anything else felt like too much just then. Gideon Whitaker, her father, a man who had opinions about everything and the conviction to act on them without asking anyone's permission, least of all his daughters. A man who had looked at Calder Boone and seen nothing worth keeping. A man who had watched his daughter fall in love and decided, with the particular arrogance of men who believed their judgment was equivalent to God's, that he knew better. Her father had told Calder she was dead. Her father had stood between them, not with anger, not with confrontation, with a lie so complete that it had simply closed the door. No argument possible, nothing to come back to. She had spent 7 years believing that Calder had chosen to leave. Calder had spent 7 years believing she was in the ground. He believed it, she said. Her voice was strange in her own ears. He was 22 years old, and he'd been told the woman he loved and the child he didn't know it was his. She'd been born before he could have known had died. He didn't come back because he thought there was nothing to come back to. Beatrice's voice was very gentle. I'm not saying that excuses everything. I'm saying that what you thought happened and what actually happened are not the same thing. Nora pressed her fingers harder against the table. He should have come back to see, she said. He should have come back and seen for himself. Yes, Beatrice said simply. No defense. No mitigation. Just agreement. Nora pulled in a breath and let it out slowly. Her father was dead now. Had been dead for 4 years, a winter fever that took him fast and left her mostly with the feeling of a door closing on an argument that could never now be finished. She had thought she'd made her peace with her father's limitations. She was finding out, sitting in a dead woman's kitchen at 5 a.m. while a blizzard hammered the walls, that she had not. She had been 22 years old. She had been 3 months alone, with nothing but a small rented house and the specific terror of a woman who has been left without warning or explanation. And her father had known why Calder didn't come. Had sat across from her at that kitchen table while she cried and told her that some men weren't worth waiting for, that this was probably for the best, that she needed to think about the future and stop looking backward. She pressed her eyes shut. Nora. She opened them. You don't have to decide anything today, Beatrice said. The storm will run at least 2 more days. Maybe 3. You've got time. Time doesn't fix this, Nora said. No, the old woman agreed, but it gives you room to think without the ground moving under your feet. The kitchen was quiet except for the storm. I want to be angry, Nora said. I need to be angry. I've been angry at him for 7 years. You can still be angry at him, Beatrice said. He didn't do what I thought he did. He didn't do what you thought he did, Beatrice agreed. But he still left, and he still believed one letter without verifying. And he still stayed gone. The old woman's voice was level and fair. There's still something to be angry about. It's just a different shape than you thought. Nora looked at her. You're a remarkably clear-headed woman for 5 in the morning. I'm old, Beatrice said. I've had a long time to practice. The front door opened. Both women turned. Calder stood in the doorway, snow on his shoulders and his face red from the cold. He looked at the two of them at the table and stopped moving. Horses needed checking, he said. Gate on the east paddock was coming loose. Beatrice stood. Sit down, I'll get coffee. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him. Sit, she said quietly, because she was not going to let him stand in the doorway all morning waiting for permission, and she was not going to let her pride make this harder than it already was. He sat down. He put his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair and looked at the cup Beatrice set in front of him with an expression of raw gratitude that had nothing to do with the coffee. The 3 of them sat in the kitchen with the storm outside and the silence between them having the particular weight of things that had been said recently that couldn't be unsaid. Finally, Calder said, I need to know how she is. She's fine, Nora said. Nora, she's fine. She's healthy. She's smart. She's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Her voice held. She's fine. He looked down at his hands around the cup. I meant how she's doing. Not just... He stopped. What is she like? What does she... He pressed his mouth together. I don't know anything about her. The words landed with more weight than anything else he could have said, because they were completely true and completely beyond argument, and carried inside them the entire shape of what had been lost. She likes horses, Nora said, after a moment, offering it the way you offer something small and necessary. Calder nodded. She likes drawing. She's good at it. She thinks insects are interesting. She has opinions about everything, and she will tell you every single one if you stand still long enough. Nora paused. She's careful. She doesn't do anything quickly. She thinks things through. Another pause. She's a lot like you. He closed his eyes. You didn't know that, she said. I'm not saying it to wound you. I'm saying it because you asked. I know. He opened his eyes. They were wet. He didn't make anything of it one way or the other, just let it be what it was. I know. Beatrice quietly removed herself from the kitchen and did not come back. Nora sat across from Calder Boone for the first time in 7 years, without Beatrice's presence as buffer or Maisie as reason to keep distance. And she felt the strangeness of it move through her, the way the cold had moved through her coat on the road. The night before, finding every gap, every place where she wasn't as sealed up as she thought she was. Your father told me you were dead, Calder said. I know. Her voice was steady. Beatrice just told me. I need you to believe I didn't know. I need stopped himself. I don't need anything. I'm not going to sit here and need things from you. I'm asking you, because it matters. Do you believe me? She studied his face. She was a woman who had developed, out of necessity, a very accurate sense of when she was being told the truth. It was not a skill she'd wanted. It came from having been lied to in important ways by people learning from it with the particular efficiency of someone who couldn't afford to keep making the same mistake. She looked at him. Yes, she said finally. I believe you. Something moved through his face that she looked away from, because it was too much right now. It was simply too much. It doesn't fix everything, she said. I know. You should have come back. Whatever you believed, you should have come back and seen. I know that too. I was young and I was alone and I was terrified, she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice. Years of it, the weight of it. I didn't know where you were. I couldn't reach you. I had a child coming and no one who was going to stand beside me for it, and I had to build something out of nothing, and I did. I built it. She pressed her fingers against the table. I built it without you, and I need you to understand that that is not something I'm ashamed of. You shouldn't be, he said. Not for a single day of it. The town judged me, she said. They still do. The town is wrong. I know that. She met his eyes. But it still costs something every day. It still costs something to walk into a room and know what people are thinking. To have your daughter looked at sideways. To be doing everything right and still be treated like you're doing something wrong. Calder's jaw worked. I'm sorry, he said, and not the quick sorry of someone trying to get past an uncomfortable moment. The slow, considered sorry of someone who understood that the words were not sufficient and was saying them anyway because not saying them would be worse. I'm not done being angry, she told him. All right. That might take a while. I understand. And whatever happens, she said carefully, whatever this storm forces us through in the next few days, Maisie comes first. She always comes first. You don't get to walk into her life and then walk out again. If you're here with some intention behind it. He looked at her to stay. Rollins? Wyoming, he said. Here, wherever here is. She held his gaze for a long moment. All right, she said finally. Not forgiveness. Not a welcome. Just acknowledgement that they were both awake and in the same kitchen, and the storm was going to last 3 days, and something had to be done about that. You can fix the east fence post, she said after breakfast. It's been unsteady for 2 weeks, and I haven't had time. He nodded. I'll need a pair of pliers and a come-along if Beatrice has one. Barn left wall near the window, he nodded again. Something ordinary in that exchange. Something necessary. The slight relief of practical matters when the emotional ones had run as far as they could go for one early morning. Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had her quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and her dark hair loose from its braid, and her eyes still soft from sleep. And she looked at both of them at the table with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child who has not yet learned that some things are supposed to make her nervous. The storm's still going, she observed. It is, Nora said. Maisie looked at Calder. Did you sleep in the barn? I did. She considered this seriously. Was it cold? Some. I slept in Mrs. Holloway's spare cot. She pulled the quilt tighter. It's a good cot. She paused. You could probably sleep inside tonight if Mama says it's all right. Nora looked at the ceiling briefly. We'll see, she said. That means yes, Maisie told Calder confidentially. He almost smiled. Nora saw the corner of his mouth move and suppressed something in her own chest by sheer force of habit. What's your name, Maisie asked him. Calder, he said. Calder Boone. I'm Maisie. She crossed to the table and climbed into the chair that Beatrice had vacated and settled her quilt and looked at him with the expression she reserved for things she was filing carefully away. Are you Mrs. Holloway's family? Her grandson, he said. She talks about you sometimes. Maisie tilted her head. She says you went away when you were young and that you had good reasons, but that going away is hard on the people who stay. Calder was quiet for a moment. She's right, he said. Maisie seemed to find this satisfactory. She turned to Nora. Is there porridge? There will be, Nora said and got up. The morning settled into something almost manageable after that. Beatrice reappeared and directed the porridge operation and found Calder an oilcloth to wear over his coat when he went out to deal with the fence post. And Maisie ate her breakfast and talked about the horses she'd seen through the barn door and asked 17 questions about cattle drives that Calder answered patiently while eating. And Nora moved through the kitchen, doing the work of the kitchen, and tried to think of this as just another morning in a house that happened to contain an unexpected person. It was not just another morning, but sometimes you had to pretend the ground was solid while you figured out where to step next. Calder went out after breakfast to deal with the fence post and several other things he noticed along the way. He came back 2 hours later with cold hands and a list of other repairs the ranch needed that he'd cataloged on his way between tasks. He reported them to Beatrice with the methodical thoroughness of a man who'd spent years managing other people's operations and knew which problems you let go and which ones got worse if you did. Beatrice listened and said, "The roof above the tack room has been concerning me since September." "I saw it," he said. "I can shore it up today if the wind drops enough." "It won't," Nora said from across the room, without looking up from the mending she'd taken up, mostly to give her hand something to do. "Not until this evening at the earliest." Calder looked at her. "You've been watching this storm," he said. "I walk out here every day," she said. "I've learned what the weather does." A small silence. "Then I'll do what I can with the tack room from the inside," he said. He went and did it. He came back at noon for the meal, ate without being asked twice, and went back out. By mid-afternoon, Maisie had appointed herself his assistant. Nora stood at the window and watched her daughter trail after Calder across the yard toward the barn, chattering at his elbow about something that had her hands moving expressively. And she watched Calder adjust his stride to Maisie's shorter one without breaking his own momentum, and something moved through that she pressed down firmly and labeled too soon. It was too soon. That was all. Beatrice appeared at her shoulder. "Don't," Nora said without turning. "I didn't say anything. I know what you were about to. You're assuming a great deal about an old woman's inner life." Nora glanced at her. Beatrice's expression was entirely serene. "He's good with her," Nora said, against her own better judgment. "He is. That doesn't mean anything yet." "No," Beatrice said. "It doesn't." They stood and watched through the window together, and neither of them said anything else. And the storm pushed at the walls, and the afternoon got darker earlier than it should, and the ranch house held all of them inside it, like a hand holding something it wasn't sure how to let go of. That evening after supper, Calder told Nora the whole story. Not the summary. The whole thing. He had left Wyoming at 22, with more ambition than sense, and a job offer from a cattle operation down south that had looked like the beginning of something real. He had written her 3 letters in the first 2 months. Then he had written to her father when the letters went unanswered, because he hadn't known what else to do. Her father had replied that Nora wanted nothing further to do with him. That she'd moved on. That he should do the same. He had been proud and hurt and 22, and he had done what a 2-year-old proud nerd do, which was believe the worst because believing the worst felt more survivable than hoping. Then 6 months later, he had sent one final letter to a friend in Rawlins, asking after her directly. The friend had written back with a message he'd gotten from Gideon Whitaker, who was known in town as a reliable man. Nora and the baby had both gone in the delivery. A tragedy the town had mourned. "I believed it," Calder said. "I don't have a better answer than that. I was young and I believed it." Nora sat across the table with her hands in her lap. "You never came to see," she said. "No, even years later. When you'd gotten older in some sense, you never came back to look." "I didn't think there was anything to look at," he said. "And I was afraid of what Rawlins would be without you in it." He paused. "That's not a good reason. I know it's not. I'm not offering it as one." She sat with that. "What made you come back now?" she asked. He looked at Beatrice's kitchen around them. "She wrote me that she wasn't well," he said. "That the ranch was getting harder to manage, and I thought—" He paused. "I thought I'd spent enough years running from the shape of what I'd lost. I thought it was time to be useful to someone instead." Nora was quiet for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals. Maisie had gone to sleep an hour ago. Beatrice had gone to bed shortly after, in the pointed way of a woman choosing to create privacy. "I'm not going to tell you this is all right," Nora said finally. "I'm not asking you to. It's going to take a long time. If there's even anything to take time over, I understand. And I'm going to need you to do something for me," she said. "Something specific." He looked at her. "I need you to not tell me what you're going to do," she said. "I've been told enough things by enough men who meant them in the moment. I need you to just do it. Whatever it is you're planning to do to prove whatever you think needs proving. Just do it, without announcement." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. And then the next morning, he got up before the house was awake and cleared the snow from the path between the house and the barn, so Beatrice wouldn't have to walk through it. And he didn't tell anyone he'd done it, and nobody said anything about it. And it was the first time in a long time that Nora had been shown something instead of promised it. She noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. The second day of the storm broke something loose in the air between them, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the careful armoring that had defined the first 24 hours. They moved around each other in the small kitchen with increasing efficiency, learning the geography of the space as shared rather than contested. When Nora reached for something, Calder was no longer in the way of it. When Calder needed a tool and she knew where it was, she told him without being asked. Maisie, who had no patience for adult complications and the social grace of someone who has decided that a thing is interesting and is going to pursue it regardless, had simply decided that Calder was worth knowing and was acting on that decision with her characteristic thoroughness. She showed him her drawings, all of them, every page of the notebook, presented in order and with commentary. He looked at each one with the complete attention that children always notice and almost never receive from adults. He asked questions about specific drawings. He said the horses were getting more accurate, which made Maisie announce that she had started counting legs, which made him nod very seriously. "That's good technique," he said. "What's technique?" "It's the way you use a skill, the method behind the doing." Maisie chewed on this. "Is there a technique? Like how to draw people?" "There is. You start with shapes, circles and rectangles. Build from the inside out. Can you show me?" He looked at Nora. Nora looked up from the mending. "Charcoal's in the notebook pocket," she said. He drew her a figure, step by step, with the careful economy of someone who didn't draw often but understood the principle. Maisie's watched with the full ferocity of her attention and then immediately attempted her own version. Hers was better than she expected. "It worked," she said, genuinely surprised. "Good technique usually does," he said. Nora set down her mending and watched her daughter's face light up over a drawing. And she thought about how Maisie had asked her once, when she was 4, why she didn't have a father, and Nora had said everyone had one. "Sweetheart, yours just isn't here." And Maisie had thought about this and said, "Does he know where we are?" And Nora had said, "He doesn't know a lot of things." And Maisie had accepted that with the equanimity of a child who doesn't yet understand what to do with the answers she doesn't get. Nora watched her daughter lean over the notebook next to the man who was her father, and she felt the weight of 7 years press against her breastbone, like a hand that was trying to say something she wasn't ready to hear. Not yet. But maybe. The storm broke on the third morning with the abruptness of Wyoming weather, the wind dropping overnight and leaving behind a white silence that was somehow louder than the noise that had preceded it. The sun came in through every window of Beatrice's ranch house with an indiscriminate brightness that made everyone squint, and Maisie declared that it was the nicest day she had ever seen. Nora stood on the front porch. The road back to town was buried but passable. She could take Maisie home. She could pick up her life exactly where she'd set it down 3 days ago, and work out what to do about Calder Boone from a sensible distance. She knew she should. She stood on the porch for a long time. Calder came out behind her. He stood a few feet back, not crowding her, and looked at the same white landscape she was looking at. "Road'll be open by noon," he said. "I know. You don't have to decide anything before then." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the road, not at her, and his expression was the careful neutral of someone keeping themselves from saying too much. "I'm not forgiving you," she said. "Not today. I know. But I'm also not done with this conversation." He turned to look at her then. She met his eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "To check on Beatrice." A pause. "You can fix the south fence while I'm here." "It needs it." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," said finally. The smallest possible acknowledgement, the exact right size. She went back inside to get Maisie and her coat and the bag she'd arrived with 3 days ago. And she told herself she was doing this because Beatrice needed looking after, and because the south fence genuinely was a problem, and for no other reason at all. She was lying to herself, but she'd been doing that for 7 years. It was going to take a little more time to stop. She came back the next day. And the day after that, and the day after that, she told herself it was for Beatrice. She told herself the old woman's cough was worsening, and the ranch needed managing, and someone had to keep track of whether horses were eating properly, and whether the tack room roof was holding after Calder's repairs. She told herself all of these things with the same conviction. She had once told herself that Calder Boone was simply a man who had chosen not to return, and she believed it about as well as she had believed that. The truth was simpler and more inconvenient. She was not done. She didn't know what she was not done with exactly. That was the problem. She couldn't name the thing she kept walking 2 miles through frozen ground toward, and naming things had always been how Nora Whitaker managed them. The things she could name, she could work with. The things she couldn't, she walked toward apparently, at 7 in the morning, with Maisie's hand in hers and no good explanation. Calder was always already working when they arrived. This was something she noticed on the 3rd morning and filed away without comment. He was never standing at the door waiting for her. He was never in the kitchen drinking coffee when she walked in, positioned to receive her arrival like something expected and owed. He was in the barn or fixing a hinge or clearing ice from the water trough. And he heard them come and came in from wherever he was, and hung his coat and washed his hands and sat down for whatever meal was being prepared with the specific quality of a man who is trying very hard not to need anything. She noticed that too. Maisie, for her part, had made her own assessment of the situation and acted on it with the decisive confidence that characterized everything she did. She had decided Calder was interesting and useful, and that she liked him, and in her experience, those 3 things together were sufficient reason to invest her attention, so she did. Every morning she went to find him wherever he was working, and either helped him or narrated at him, both of which Calder accepted with a patience that Nora watched from a distance and measured carefully. He never talked down to her. He never performed patience the way adults sometimes did with children, that slightly theatrical tolerance that children could always see through. He just answered her questions straight, corrected her when she was wrong without making a drama of it, and occasionally asked her things back that showed he had actually been listening to what she'd said 20 minutes earlier. On the 4th morning, Maisie told him that she wanted to learn to ride. Calder looked up from the harness he was mending. "Your mother teach you anything about horses yet?" "She knows the basics," Maisie said, with the confidence of someone who was unclear on what basics meant, but certain she had them. Calder glanced across the barn at Nora, who was measuring grain. "Your mother's call," he said. Maisie turned to Nora with an expression of concentrated supplication. Nora kept measuring grain. "Ask me again in a week," she said. Maisie's mouth opened. "A week," Nora repeated. Maisie closed her mouth and turned back to Calder. "She does that when she wants to think about something," she told him. "Good habit," he said. She said yes to the cat after 3 days. "Then maybe horses won't take the full week," he said. Nora set down the grain scoop. "I can hear both of you." "We know," Maisie said serenely. Nora picked the scoop back up, and she turned away before either of them could see her mouth doing something she wasn't prepared to explain. What happened between them in those days was not dramatic. That was what made it hard to argue with. There were no grand moments, no declarations, no confrontations that resolved into something clean and cathartic. There was just the accumulation of small ordinary things done well, consistently, without announcement. He fixed the south fence and didn't tell her he'd done it. He noticed that Beatrice's hip was worse on cold mornings and began leaving the indoor chores for those days and taking on the outdoor ones himself, so the old woman didn't have to navigate the icy porch steps more than necessary. He found the leak in the barn roof that Nora had been trying to locate for 3 weeks, the one that was dripping into the grain bin, at an angle that made it impossible to find the origin, and patched it on a Fiat Tuesday without saying a word to anyone about it until Nora noticed the bin was dry and looked at him, and he said, "Found the leak." Fixed it, and went back to what he was doing. She stood in the barn for a moment afterward. Then she went and made sure the horses had water. It was on the 5th evening that Beatrice had the bad spell. Nora was heating milk for Maisie when she heard the sound from the back of the house, not a fall, something less dramatic but more frightening, the particular sound of a person struggling to breathe. She was through the kitchen and into Beatrice's room before she'd fully processed what she was doing, and she found the old woman sitting upright in the bed with both hands pressed flat against the mattress and her face the wrong color. "Get Calder," Nora said to Maisie, who had appeared in the doorway. Maisie ran. Nora sat beside Tris and put one hand on the old woman's back and the other on her hands and talked to her in the level, steady voice she used when things were frightening and needed to not be frightening. She talked about nothing in particular, the fence post, the horses, the way the light had gone gold that afternoon across the yard, and she kept her hands exactly where they were and let her voice be the thing that held the room together. Calder came in 30 seconds later with Maisie at his heels. He assessed the situation in one look and said, "I'll get the doctor." "I'll get the doctor," he said again, already turning. He was on a horse and gone inside 4 minutes. He came back with Dr. Calloway in just over an hour, which was faster than Nora had thought possible over those roads in that cold, and she did not want to think about what that hour had looked like from a horse. The doctor stayed for 2 hours and left with instructions, and a worried look he tried to partially conceal and didn't entirely manage. Beatrice's heart was giving her trouble. This was not new information exactly, but it was newly serious information, and the doctor was blunt with both Nora and Calder in the way that doctors in that era were when they wanted you to understand that something had shifted. "She needs consistent care," he said, "not visits." Consistent care. Nora sat with that after the doctor left. Calder found her in the kitchen at 9 o'clock, Maisie long since asleep, the house quiet except for Beatrice's even breathing from the back room. "I'll stay," he said. He was still in his coat, having just come in from checking the horses. "Full time. I won't leave the property." "That's a significant change to your life," Nora said. "Not the life I had 2 weeks ago anyway," he said simply. She looked at him. "You need sleep," she said, "and you need to eat something." "Sit down." He sat. She reheated what was left from supper and set it in front of him and sat across from him with her hands around a cold cup and watched him eat for a moment. "She loves you very much," Nora said. He paused. "I should have come back sooner," she said. "You should have. Not cruel, just true." She was finding lately that the truth was easier to say to him than it had ever been with anyone else, which was inconvenient and strange and something she was choosing not to examine too closely yet. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I heard you the first time." "I mean it generally," he said, "not just about Beatrice." She was quiet. "I know what you mean," she said. Neither of them said anything else about it. But the understanding sat between them in the kitchen, like a third person, solid and warm, not asking anything, just present. The following week was marked by the settling of something between them that didn't have a name but had a texture. The guardedness didn't disappear, it was too old for that, too well constructed. But it thinned, the way ice thins in the early days of a thaw, still there but no longer fully bearing weight. Nora found herself telling him things, small things first. The argument she'd had with the seamstress about wages. The problem with Maisie's boots, which had developed a split in the sole that she'd patched twice and didn't think would hold another winter. The fact that the laundry work was drying her hands out until they cracked at the knuckles and bled, and she'd run out of the salve that helped. Calder listened. He didn't immediately try to solve things. That was something she noticed. When she talked about the wages problem, he didn't tell her what to do about the seamstress. When she mentioned the boots, he didn't immediately offer to buy new ones, which she would have refused. He just listened, asked a question or two that were actually questions and not poorly disguised suggestions, and let her get to the end of whatever she was saying before he said anything back. Then one afternoon, a jar of hand salve appeared on Beatrice's kitchen windowsill. No note, no mention. Nora looked at it. She looked across the yard to where Calder was working on the paddock gate. She picked up the jar. She didn't say anything to him about it that day. But the next morning she came in, and her hands were not cracked. He noticed that and said nothing either. There was a whole language developing between them that used no words, and Nora was fluent in it, before she'd fully consented to learning it, which was how the important languages always went. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after the storm, that Maisie asked the question. She had been working in the barn with Calder. Learning to properly clean a horse's hooves, she had escalated from wanting to ride to wanting to understand everything about horses, which Calder had encouraged by treating each stage as a legitimate step rather than an obstacle between her and the thing she wanted. Nora was inside with Beatrice, who was sitting up and better today, good enough to be demanding company, which was how Nora knew she was genuinely improved. She heard Maisie come back into the house. She heard the particular quality of her daughter's silence when Maisie had a question she wasn't sure about asking. Nora looked up from the book she'd been reading aloud to Beatrice. Maisie stood in the doorway. "Can I ask something?" she said. "Always, Nora, Papa." The room went completely still. Beatrice's hands went still in her lap. Nora set the book down. She looked at her daughter's face, those dark, serious eyes that had been asking careful questions for 6 years, that had never been given an answer that satisfied, because Nora had never had an answer that was complete. She thought about saying not yet. She thought about saying it's complicated. She thought about every version of the partial truth she had been offering Maisie for years, and knew, looking at her daughter's face, that every one of them would be wrong. Maisie was 6 years old. She deserved the truth that was available. "Yes," Nora said. "He is." Maisie absorbed this with the stillness of a child receiving significant information and sorting it in real time. "Does he know?" she asked. "He," Nora said. "Does he want to be?" Nora paused only for a moment. "Yes, sweetheart, he very much does." Maisie stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she turned and went back to the barn. Beatrice looked at Nora. Nora looked back at her. Well, the old woman said softly. "Don't," Nora said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were about to say several things." Beatrice settled her hands in her lap and looked very deliberately at the middle distance. Nora picked the book back up. Her hands were shaking. She held the book until they stopped, and then she read another 3 pages aloud, while her heart hammered at a frequency she chose to simply wait out, the way she waited out everything that couldn't be solved by action steadily, without complaint, watching for the moment when she could move again. In the barn, Calder was finishing up with the horses when Maisie came back in. He heard her come in and glanced up. She was wearing her serious face, the one that meant she had been thinking hard about something and had come to conclusions. "My mama told me," Maisie said. He went very still. "Told you what?" he said carefully. "That you're my papa." She said it the way she said things she'd already made her peace with plainly, without drama. "I thought you probably were. You look at me the way you're supposed to look at people you belong to." Calder set down what he was holding. He turned to face her. "Maisie," he started. "You don't have to explain," she said. "Mama said you didn't know where we were for a long time. And that it wasn't because you didn't want to know." She tilted her head. "Is that right?" "It's right," he said. She studied him for a moment with those eyes that had always been his, though he hadn't known it until 2 weeks ago, and the knowledge still hit him like a physical thing every time he looked at her. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to stay. You promise?" He crouched down so he was at her level and looked at her straight. "I promise," he said, "and I'm going to tell you every time I have to go somewhere, so you always know where I am. I'm never going to disappear without you knowing exactly where I am and when I'm coming back. All right?" Maisie looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around his neck. He closed his eyes. His hands came up and held her small shoulders with the terrified care of someone holding something they are, only now understanding they had nearly lost entirely, not because of distance, but because of time. Because of 6 years of her existence they would never recover. 6 years of her laughter, and her questions, and her drawings, and her boots, and her opinions, and her particular way of thinking that was so exactly like his own that it broke something open in his chest every time he saw it. He held her carefully. She patted his back twice with the pragmatic efficiency of a child administering comfort. "It's okay," she told him. "You're here now." He didn't trust his voice, so he just held on. Nora appeared in the barn doorway a few minutes later. She had known where Maisie had gone. She had given it 10 minutes and then followed, because she had been Maisie's mother for 6 years, and she knew how to give her daughter space and how to be present at the same time, and she had wanted to see what she was going to see, whatever it was, with her own eyes. She stood in the doorway and watched Calder hold her daughter with his eyes closed. She watched Maisie pull back and look at his face with that direct assessing gaze and say, "Your eyes are red." "I know," he said. "Mama's eyes go red too when she cries, but she hides it better." "I'll work on that," he said. "You don't have to," Maisie told him seriously. "Mama says hiding feelings is for things that don't matter. If something matters, you're supposed to feel it." He looked up then and saw Nora in the doorway. She didn't move. He didn't look away. There was something happening in the 4 feet between the barn doorway and where he was crouching. Something that had been building for 11 days, and the 3 days before that, and if she was being fully honest with herself, for 7 years in the form of an absence, a negative space where something was supposed to be and wasn't. "Your mama's very wise," Calder said. "I know," Maisie agreed. Nora stepped into the barn. "Come inside," she said. "Beatrice wants company." Maisie went immediately, already talking about what Beatrice had said that morning about her husband building the barn and whether she thought barns were interesting. Nora started to follow her. Calder said her name. She stopped. She turned and looked at him. He had stood up, but hadn't moved toward her, and there was something on his face. She didn't have a word for not the careful, controlled thing he'd been wearing for 11 days. Something rawer and more honest than that. "Thank you," he said. She knew he didn't mean for letting him stay. He didn't mean for tolerating his presence. He meant for raising Maisie the way she had been raised, with those steady eyes and that direct heart and the capacity to walk into a barn and forgive a stranger for something vast without making it complicated. "I didn't do it for you," Nora said. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she went inside. There was no great shift the next morning, nothing that would have looked significant from the outside. But Nora made coffee for 3 without being asked, and when Calder came in, she pushed a cup toward his side of the table without looking up from what she was reading, and he sat down and drank it without comment. And the ordinary ease of that small exchange was more significant than anything either of them could have said. Beatrice watched this from across the kitchen. She said nothing. But her expression was the expression of a woman who had waited a long time for something and was watching it finally, tentatively, begin. It was 2 days later that Beatrice got worse again. Not dramatically, not the frightening episode of the week before. Worse in the quiet way, the way of someone for whom the body is becoming a less reliable house. She slept more. She ate less. She was sharp and present when she was awake, asked questions and remembered the answers, and told Maisie 3 different stories about the ranch's history, and corrected Calder twice about the location of his grandfather's tools. But she tired quickly, and the tiredness went deeper than sleep seemed to reach. Calder watched his grandmother carefully and said nothing about what he was watching to anyone except Nora, and he said it to her late one evening after Maisie was asleep quietly, with his hands flat on the kitchen table. "She's not going to get better," he said. "Is she?" It wasn't exactly a question. Nora looked at him. "The doctor said sometimes people her age rally," she said carefully. "That it comes and goes, Nora." She stopped. She looked at him. "No," she said, because he had asked for the truth, and she was done giving anyone she trusted the softened version. "I don't think she's going to get better. I think she's getting slowly worse, and it's going to continue to get slowly worse, and all we can do is make sure she's comfortable, and that she's not alone, and that she has good days while she can have them." He absorbed that. He looked at his hands for a moment. "All right," he said. That was all. Just all right. Accepting it without argument, without drama, with the quiet practicality of a man deciding what his job is and committing to doing it. She watched him do this and felt something shift further in the architecture of her resistance. "You should sleep," she said. "You were up before 4 this morning." "I know." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm always all right," she said. He studied her face for a moment. "That's not actually an answer," he said. She looked at him. The fire had burned very low. The kitchen was quiet and warm, and the house was holding all of them inside it again the way it had during the storm. And she had the same feeling she'd had then, of walls close enough to make avoidance impossible. "I'm scared for her," Nora said. She heard her own voice say it, and understood that she was offering something not the same thing as what she'd kept separate, but in the same direction. Calder didn't rush to fix it. He just nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They sat with that together for a minute. Then Nora said, "Go to sleep, Calder." He got up. He took his cup to the basin. He stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked back at her. "You don't have to do all of this alone," he said. Not asking her to lean on him, not offering to take anything away from her. Just stating a fact that was available if she chose to use it. She looked at him. "Good night," she said. He nodded. "Good night, Nora." And he went. She sat in the kitchen alone for another hour, listening to the quiet house, and she did not have a name yet for the thing that was happening to her carefully constructed life, but she knew it was happening. And she knew it was not the same as the thing that had happened when she was 22 and brave and stupid with love. This was something slower, something built from what she'd seen rather than what she'd been promised. Something that frightened her in a completely different way. She banked the fire. She checked on Beatrice sleeping, her breathing even, her face in the lamplight, showing the marks of the years without apology. She went to bed. She lay awake for a long time, and she thought about a man who fixed things without announcing it, who answered her daughter's questions straight, who crouched to eye level in a barn and made a promise with his eyes open and his voice steady and no audience to perform for. She thought about what it meant to trust someone, not the way you trusted when you were 22 and had no evidence to the contrary. The way you trusted when you were 29 and you had been wrong before, and you knew exactly what being wrong had cost, and you were choosing, with full knowledge of that cost, to look at someone's and decide you believed what you were seeing. She was not there yet, but she could see it from where she was standing. And that, for Nora Whitaker, was more than she had been willing to admit a week ago. Which was either progress or the beginning of a very expensive mistake. She fell asleep before she could decide which, and in the room at the back of the house, Beatrice Holloway lay with her eyes open in the dark for a little while, listening to the quiet of a house with people in it. And she felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with her heart and everything to do with it. She had kept a secret she should not have kept. She had decided things she had no right to decide. But lying in the dark, listening to the sounds of her family finally, imperfectly, finding each other in the rooms of her house, She thought that perhaps even the wrong decisions occasionally arrived, somewhere worth arriving. She closed her eyes. The Wyoming night was cold and clear. And inside the old ranch house, 4 people slept under the same roof for the first time, none of them certain what came next, all of them present enough to find out. Beatrice died on a Thursday. Not in the frightening way, not with struggle or alarm. She went the way she had lived quietly, on her own terms, in her own bed, with the particular dignity of a woman who had decided long ago that she would not make her dying into a burden for the people she loved. Nora found her in the early morning when she came to bring the tea that Beatrice had stopped being able to finish, but still liked to hold. The cup was already on the table. Beatrice's hands were folded. Her face had the expression of someone who had set something down that had been heavy for a long time. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she set the tea down beside the one already there, pulled the blanket up, and went to find Calder. He was in the barn. She stood in the barn doorway and said his name, and he turned and looked at her face, and he knew before she said a word. She watched it move through him, not shock, because they had both been watching and waiting, but the particular grief of something you have been bracing for that still arrives with more weight than the bracing prepared you for. He set down what he was holding. He walked past her into the house. She gave him 10 minutes. Then she went in too. Maisie was still asleep. Nora decided to let her sleep. There would be time enough for the truth in an hour, and 6-year-olds needed their sleep more than they needed to wake up immediately into grief. She found Calder sitting beside Beatrice's bed with his elbows on his knees and his head bent, not praying exactly, but doing whatever the equivalent was for a man who had been raised with faith and worn it down to something quieter and more private over the years on the road. Nora sat in the chair on the other side. They sat together in the early morning with the woman who had, in her stubborn and imperfect and entirely intentional way, brought them both back to a place they had needed to be. She knew, Nora said finally, quietly, from the very beginning. She knew who I was. I know, Calder said. She never said a word. That was Beatrice, he said. She thought people needed to find their own way to things. That if you told them, it didn't take. Nora looked at the old woman's face. She was right, she said. Calder looked up. Nora met his eyes across the bed. Neither of them said anything else. But something passed between them in that moment, not comfort exactly, not the soft round thing that word implied. Something more like recognition, the acknowledgement of 2 people who have been through something hard in the same place at the same time, and come out the other side changed in ways they are still counting up. The funeral was small. The ground was still frozen hard enough that it took the men 2 days to dig the grave properly. And in that time Nora organized what needed organizing with the focused practicality that had gotten her through every difficult thing in her life. She wrote the notices. She arranged for the minister. She found the dress Beatrice had indicated, years ago in a conversation that Nora had filed away without knowing why, that she'd want to be buried in. Calder handled the ranch. He worked from before dawn until after dark, doing the physical work of an operation that still needed tending regardless of grief, and he did it without complaint and without expectation of acknowledgement, which meant that Nora acknowledged it anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. You need to sleep, she told him on the second night. I'm fine. He stopped. He looked at her. Sit down, she said. Eat something. He sat down. She put food in front of him, and sat across from him and watched him eat and said, she was proud of you. Whatever else happened, whatever years you lost with her, she was proud of you. She told me so the second month I was coming here. Before I knew you were related. He set down his fork. What did she say? She said she had a grandson who made mistakes the way interesting people always did by caring too much about the wrong things at the wrong times. Nora paused. She said she believed he'd figure it out eventually. That he had his grandfather's stubbornness, and that always worked out in the end, even when it was infuriating in the middle. Calder was quiet for a moment. She told you that before she knew you knew me? She told me that before she knew I knew you were related to her, Nora said. I think she'd already worked out the rest. He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. It was the first time in 3 days that either of them had come close. She was something, he said. She was everything, Nora said. To me, she was everything. She was the first person in Rollins who treated me like I was worth the trouble. Calder looked at her. More people should have, he said. Yes, Nora said simply. They should have. The funeral was on a Friday afternoon. There were 12 people at the graveside, which was more than Nora had expected, and fewer than Beatrice had deserved. Several neighboring ranchers, the minister, 2 women from the far end of town who had known Beatrice when she was younger, and came with the specific quiet dignity of people paying a debt that had no official name. And then there were the people from Rollins proper. Nora had not invited them. She had sent the notice, because that was the done thing, and several came because that was also the done thing, and most of them paid their respects and left without incident. But not all of them. Mrs. Garfield came. She stood at the back of the small gathering in her dark coat and her sharp eyes, and she watched Nora and Calder standing together with Maisie between them. Maisie holding her mother's hand and occasionally reaching for Calder's too, with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has decided where she belongs and acts accordingly. And afterward, when the gathering had dispersed and the minister had gone, and the neighboring ranchers had offered their condolences and headed back to their own properties, Mrs. Garfield approached. Nora saw her coming. She straightened. Not defensively, just with the particular alignment of a woman who has learned that being looked down on is more bearable when you're standing at your full height. Mrs. Garfield, she said. The woman looked at Maisie. Then at Calder. So the talk is true, she said. The tone was not quite hostile. It was the tone of a woman delivering a verdict. Nora held her gaze. What talk would that be? That this is Calder Boone. A look at him. That he's back, Nora agreed. And that child is his. Maisie is mine, Nora said. Her voice was completely level. She has been mine for 6 years. That hasn't changed and it won't change. Mrs. Garfield looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through the older woman's expression, not softening exactly, but a slight recalibration, the look of someone reassessing the architecture of something they thought they understood. You've done a fine job with her, the woman said, and it came out sounding almost surprised, which was the most honest thing Nora had ever heard Mrs. Garfield say. I know, Nora said, not thank you. Not gracious deflection. Just I know. Calder stood beside her and did not speak. He had understood what she was doing and what she needed from him in that moment, which was to stand beside her and not in front of her. And he did exactly that. Mrs. Garfield left. Maisie looked up at Nora. Was she being mean? Maisie asked. She was being what she knows how to be, Nora said. Which isn't always the same thing. Maisie considered this. That seems like her problem, she said. It is, Nora said. Entirely. They walked back to the ranch together in the cold afternoon light. Maisie between them, the ground frozen under their boots. The sky going pink at the edges, the way Wyoming skies did when they were done being difficult and wanted to be beautiful for a while. Nora walked and felt the particular strange lightness of a grief that has been sitting on your chest that finally gets properly acknowledged. Beatrice was gone. That was real, and it was going to keep being real for a long time. But she was not diminished by the acknowledgement of it. She had been fully present for the last weeks of the old woman's life. She had brought bread and medicine and firewood and company, and the specific gift of being someone you could be honest with. She had given Beatrice what Beatrice had given her, which was simply this, someone who showed up. That was enough. It had to be enough. It was. The week after the funeral, the complications began. Beatrice had left a will. This was not the complication. The will was simple and clearly written and witnessed by 2 people in Rollins who were still living, the ranch, its land and everything on it, to her grandson Calder Boone. Her personal effects and a small sum set aside in the bank to Nora Whitaker, with a note attached to the bank document in Beatrice's handwriting that said only, "You earned this, girl. Don't you dare give it back." Nora had read the note standing at the bank manager's desk and pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling and breathed through it. The complication was not the will. The complication was a man named Harlan Briggs. He arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the funeral, in a good coat and a bad mood, with a leather satchel under his arm and the particular walk of a man who has decided in advance that things are going to go his way. Calder met him in the yard. Nora was inside, but she heard the conversation through the window and stepped closer without announcing it. Harlan Briggs introduced himself as a land agent, representing a consortium of interests that had been attempting to purchase the Holloway property for several years. He explained, a prior arrangement with the late Beatrice Holloway, an agreement, he said, that predated any will, that constituted a legally binding verbal contract, and that entitled his clients to first purchase rights on the land. Calder listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, "Do you have anything in writing?" Briggs smiled the smile of a man who had prepared for this question. "Mrs. Holloway's signature on a letter of intent," he said. "Dated 18 months ago." Calder held out his hand. Briggs handed over a folded document. Calder read it. His expression did not change. He handed it back. "That's a letter expressing willingness to consider an offer," he said. "It's not a contract. It doesn't constitute binding agreement." Briggs's smile adjusted slightly. "That's one interpretation," he said. "It's the correct one," Calder said. "The land was left to me by legal will. If your clients want to make an offer, they can make an offer. But they have no prior claim." Mr. Boone Briggs's voice dropped into a register that was not quite a threat, and was trying very hard not to have to become one. "The people I represent are patient, but they have resources. This property is isolated, it's expensive to maintain, and you've only just returned to Wyoming. It would be in everyone's interest." "I think we're done for today," Calder said. Briggs looked at him. "You should take some time to think this over," he said. "I don't need time," Calder said. "The ranch isn't for sale. If that changes, you'll hear from me. Good day, Mr. Briggs." Then Briggs nodded once and walked back to his horse. Nora stepped back from the window. When Calder came inside, she was at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup she hadn't been drinking from. "He'll be back," she said. Calder sat down. He looked tired, in the way people looked tired when they were holding more than the immediate thing. He mentioned resources. "Briggs works for Morris Calloway," Nora said. Calder looked up. "You know who he represents?" "Morris Calloway has been trying to buy up land on the east side of town for 3 years," Nora said. "He already owns 2 ranches he bought from families who couldn't keep going. He works through agents, so his name doesn't get on the initial conversations." She set down her cup. "He's patient and he's wealthy, and he's not used to being told no." Calder studied her face. "How do you know all this?" "Because I walk 2 miles into this property every day, and I talk to the people along the way, and I pay attention," she said. "Poor women learn very quickly that information is the only currency that costs nothing to collect." He held her gaze. "What do you think he'll do?" he asked. "He'll try to find a pressure point," she said. "Something to make keeping the ranch more trouble than selling it. He'll do it quietly and through legitimate channels so there's nothing directly to fight." She paused. "He might look at the deed, or the property taxes. Beatrice was behind on taxes 2 years ago. She caught up, but there's a record of it. He could use that to create the impression of instability." Calder sat with this. "You've thought about this kind of problem before," he said. "I've been on the wrong end of this kind of problem before," she said. "Different scale. Same mechanics." He leaned back in his chair. "I need the deed and the tax records," he said. "Everything Beatrice had." "Do you know where she kept her documents?" "Yes," Nora said. "Come on." She took him to the small drawer in Beatrice's room where the old woman had kept the papers she considered important. organized with a precision that Nora had always privately admired, not labeled or fancy. Just arranged in an order that made sense if you knew her, which Nora did. She sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled up the chair. They went through the papers together, and Nora named each document, and what it meant, and where the potential vulnerabilities were. And Calder listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that he was receiving information he didn't have and needed, and was not going to waste it by pretending otherwise. The taxes are current, Nora said. She paid through the end of the year 2 months before she died. Whatever Briggs tries to do with the tax history, it won't hold. The deed? Clean. She had it filed properly when her husband died. No liens. Good, he was quiet then. He'll find something else. He will, she agreed. Men like Calloway always do. But finding something and making it work are different things. She handed him the last document, and he looked at it and set it on the stack. The room was quiet. They were sitting very close together. The kind of close that happens when you're sharing a small space over a specific task, and neither of you has thought about the physical logistics of it, because the task has been the whole focus. And then the task is done, and the logistics announce themselves. Nora became aware of this all at once. She stood. I'll make a list of what I think he'll try, she said, moving back to the kitchen with the specific purposefulness of someone redirecting themselves. You should take it to a lawyer in town. Not Addison, he's connected to Calloway. Henderson on the north end. Calder came into the kitchen behind her. Nora. She was already at the table, already pulling paper toward her. Nora, he said again. She looked up. He was standing across the kitchen watching her, with an expression that wasn't asking for anything. That was simply honest in the way he had learned to be honest with her over the past weeks directly, without performance. Just the thing itself. I know this isn't the time, he said. I know there's a lot that's still not resolved between us. I'm not asking you to resolve it today. A pause. I just need you to know that I'm aware of what you've done in the past few weeks. Not just for Beatrice. For all of it. I know what it's cost you. She held his gaze. It hasn't cost me anything I wasn't willing to spend, she said carefully. I know, he said. That's what I mean. A moment. She looked down at the paper. I'll have the list done by this afternoon, she said. Go see Henderson tomorrow. Take the deed and the tax records. He went. She wrote the list. And somewhere in the writing of it, the careful, practical enumeration of threats and counters, and legal positions and documents, she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for weeks. Not resolution. Not the neat closing of a thing. But the particular calm that comes when you have decided, below the level of argument, that you are on the right side of something, that you are going to fight for it, that the fighting is worth it. She was on the right side of this ranch. She was on the right side of Beatrice's legacy. She was on the right side of a 6-year-old girl who had walked into a barn and forgiven a stranger and patted his back with pragmatic kindness of someone who understood. At 6, that love was a decision more than a feeling. She was not yet certain she was on the right side of Calder Boone. But she was getting less certain of the alternative. Calder went to Henderson the next morning. He came back in the early afternoon with the lawyer's assessment, which aligned almost exactly with Nora's, which Henderson had apparently noted with a particular interest and who appreciated accurate intelligence, wherever it came from. He wants to meet you, Calder said. Henderson? He said whoever put this list together understands the situation better than most clients he works with. Nora looked at the list in Calder's hand. Tell him I'm familiar with being underestimated, she said. Calder almost smiled. Briggs came back as expected on the following Monday. This time he had a different document. A letter, he said, written by Beatrice in her own hand, expressing reservations about leaving the ranch to a grandson she had not seen in many years and wondering whether an alternative arrangement might better serve the property. He handed it to Calder. Calder looked at it. Then he handed it to Nora. She read it twice. This is her handwriting, she said. Calder looked at her sharply. But, he said, because he heard something in her voice. But Beatrice wrote with her left hand tilted, Nora said. She'd had an injury years ago that affected her grip. Every letter she wrote went slightly uphill on the right side of the line. She held the letter up. This is level. Whoever copied her style didn't know about the tilt. She set the letter down on the porch railing. Briggs's face had gone very carefully neutral. That's a significant accusation, he said. I'm not accusing you of anything, Nora said. I'm telling you what I observe. You can take the letter to anyone who knew Beatrice Holloway well and ask them to look at it. Or you can take it to a document examiner in Cheyenne and let them look at it. She held his gaze. I'd suggest you think carefully about which of those options you prefer. A long silence. Briggs picked up the letter. He folded it. He put it in his satchel. I'll be in contact, he said. Mr. Henderson will be receiving our correspondence on this matter, Calder said. I'll let him know to expect something from you. Briggs left. Nora watched him go. Calder was beside her on the porch, and when the man was far enough down the road, he turned to her and said, very quietly, you just called his bluff. I stated an observation, she said. He drew his own conclusions. What if he comes back with something harder to refute? Then we deal with that, she said. But he won't. Men like Calloway don't want a public fight. They want a quiet acquisition. The minute it stops being quiet, it stops being worth it to them. Calder looked at her. Where did you learn to think like that? He said. Same place I learned everything, she said. By needing to and having no one to do it for me. That afternoon, Maisie asked to go to the barn to see the horses. Calder took her. Nora watched from the window as he lifted her up onto the paddock fence so she could see over it properly, his hands steady at her waist. Maisie pointing at the horses and talking with her characteristic intensity, while Calder listened and answered and occasionally pointed at something she'd missed. She watched them for a long time. Then she made dinner. When they came in, Maisie was flushed from the cold and talking without stopping about the dun-colored mare that she had decided was the most intelligent horse she had ever seen, which she acknowledged was a short list but felt strongly about regardless. She looked right at me, Maisie insisted, like she knew something. She probably did, Calder said. Horses read people. That one's good at it. What did she read about me? She came toward you instead of moving off, he said. That's a good sign. It means she decided you were worth knowing. Maisie considered this. I decide that about people too, she said. I decided about you pretty fast, I know, he said. I noticed. Mama takes longer, Maisie said. Nora set a bowl on the table with slightly more emphasis than necessary. Mama's in the room, she said. I know, Maisie said, entirely unrepentant. I'm just saying what's true. Calder looked at Nora. Nora looked at him. She looked away first, but she was smiling when she did. He saw it. He didn't say anything about it. He was learning exactly when to not say things, which was, she was finding, one of his better qualities. The matter of Calloway and Briggs resolved itself as Nora had predicted, in the quiet way of men who prefer not to be visible when their methods are scrutinized. Henderson sent 2 letters. Briggs did not respond to the second one. Calloway's name never appeared formally in any of it, which was how he preferred to operate, and also, Nora pointed out, why he had no real leverage. You couldn't make a formal claim when you'd made a point of keeping your name off everything formal. The ranch was Calder's. Clean, documented, done. He told Nora on a Tuesday evening when Maisie was working on her drawings at the kitchen table and Beatrice's absence was a presence in the room the way losses often were, occupying the space they'd always occupied by the particular quality of the silence there. It's settled, he said. Good, she said. Henderson thinks Calloway will try another property. Someone easier to pressure. That's unfortunate for whoever he finds next, she said. Yes, Calder agreed. A pause. What will you do with it? She asked. Work it, he said. What else would I do with a ranch? It's a lot of land for one person. It is, he agreed, and said nothing else, and she understood that he was declining to make a speech about it, which was the correct decision. Maisie looked up from her drawing. "I could help," she offered. "You absolutely could," Calder said. "I'm very good with horses now," Maisie said. "I counted all their legs and everything. That's the first step," he said seriously. Maisie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. Nora looked at them both at the table together. Maisie bent over her notebook, tongue at the corner of her mouth the way it went when she was concentrating. And Calder with his elbows on the table watching her, with the expression he wore when he thought nobody was looking at him, the one he hadn't learned to conceal yet, the one that was simply love in its plainest and most unguarded form. She saw it. She let herself see it. And she thought about what Beatrice had said in the second week of Nora's visits, before she knew anything, before the storm, before all of it. She had said, unprompted, while Nora was mending a curtain, "Some people come into your life and you think they need something from you. Then you find out you needed them just as much. You just arrived at the needing from different directions." Nora had nodded and kept mending and not thought much about it. She thought about it now. She thought about it for a long time. The fire burned low, and Maisie fell asleep at the table with her cheek on her notebook, which she did sometimes when she'd been outside and run through her energy. And Calder carried her carefully to the cot without waking her, while Nora cleared the table, and he came back and they were alone in the kitchen, with the fire and the quiet and everything that had been building between them for weeks. Nora set down the last dish. She looked at the kitchen, at the table, at the window where the dark Wyoming night was settled and clear. She would have liked this, she said. Beatrice. She would have liked seeing the house like this. "Full," Calder said. "Full," Nora agreed. He was standing near the window. She was near the stove. The kitchen was not large. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever you answer, I'm still here." "I'm not asking because the answer changes that." She turned to look at him. "Then ask," she said. "Do you think we're going to be all right?" he said. Not the grand question, not the declaration. Just that the honest, specific, practical question of a man who wanted to know if the thing he was building toward had a foundation under it, or if he had been reading the situation the way hope made people read things, generously and wrong. Nora looked at him. She thought about everything. The storm. The kitchen at 5 in the morning. The jar of salve on the windowsill. The way he'd crouched to Maisie's eye level in the barn. The way he'd stood beside her and not in front of her when Mrs. Garfield came. The way he'd listened to her list without his pride getting in the way. The way he carried her daughter to bed without waking her. The way he was standing right now, waiting for an honest answer and meaning it when he said the answer didn't change what he was doing. "I think so," she said. "It wasn't the full thing yet." She wasn't there yet, but it was true. And it was the truest thing she could give him right now, and she watched him receive it with the careful hands of someone who knew the difference between what was being offered and what was being withheld, and chose to be grateful for the offering rather than impatient for the rest. "That's enough," he said. "It's not everything," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's real, and real is better than everything when everything isn't here yet." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Good night, Calder." "Good night, Nora." She went to check on Casey. She stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at her daughter sleeping with her hand curled near her face and her dark lashes against her cheek. And she felt something that didn't have a simple name: grief and love, and the particular relief of a woman who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just tentatively allowed herself to believe that she might not have to anymore. Not certain, not yet, but close enough to see it, and that for Nora Whitaker was the most hopeful she had allowed herself to be in a very long time. The morning Nora decided to move into the ranch, she didn't announce it. She simply arrived with more than she usually carried. 2 bags instead of 1, Maisie's second coat, the small tin box where she kept the papers that mattered, Maisie's birth record, the deed to the two-room house she had been renting on the west end of town. 3 months of saved wages that she had never let herself touch, because she'd always understood that the saved wages were the difference between surviving and not surviving, and she had never before felt certain enough about any future to spend them on it. Calder was in the barn when they came through the gate. He came out and looked at the bags. He looked at Nora. He didn't say a word. "There's a back room that's not being used," she said. "Maisie and I will take it. I'll pay what I would have paid for the rental." He opened his mouth. "Don't argue with me about the money," she said. He closed his mouth. "The house in town isn't worth what I've been paying for it," she continued. "This makes practical sense. Beatrice's kitchen garden needs someone who knows what they're doing with it in spring. The horses need consistent handling, and you can't run this operation alone without hiring help you can't afford yet." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not doing this because of anything other than it being the sensible choice." A pause. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. Maisie had already gone inside. Nora picked up the bags. He reached for one. She let him take it. That was the whole negotiation. No speeches, no conditions outlined in advance. Just two practical people standing in a cold yard, making a decision that both of them knew was about more than the practical reasons offered for it, and both of them choosing, by unspoken agreement, to let the practical reasons stand unchallenged for now. The town noticed, of course. The town always noticed. By the end of the first week, Nora was aware that her decision had been discussed, assessed, and rendered upon by most of Rawlins's eligible opinion holders, and that the verdict was roughly what she had expected, a combination of disapproval and prurient curiosity dressed up as concern. She walked into the general store on a Thursday morning and felt the particular quality of a room that has just stopped talking. She was getting better at this. She had been getting better at this for 6 years. She picked up a basket and moved to the shelves and made her selections with the focused efficiency of someone who had a list and intended to complete it regardless of the temperature in the room. Mrs. Garfield was behind the counter. Two women Nora knew by face and not by any warmth were near the fabric bolts, and they were watching her with the specific attentiveness of people waiting for something to react to. Nora set her selections on the counter. Mrs. Garfield began counting them up. One of the women near the fabric, a thin, sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Holt, said, without quite addressing anyone directly, "I heard the Holloway place has new arrangements." Nora did not look up from her purse. "Some women, Mrs. Holt continued, in the tone of a woman who had opinions about some women, have no sense of what looks proper. The store was very quiet. Nora counted out her coins. She set them on the counter. She picked up her basket. She turned around and looked at Mrs. Holt directly. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "I have worked 3 jobs for 6 years to raise my daughter without assistance from this town or anyone in it. I have walked 2 miles in the cold every day of every winter to keep an elderly woman fed and cared for who would otherwise have managed it alone. I have done none of this asking for anyone's opinion of it." She held the woman's gaze without effort. "I don't intend to start now." The store was very, very quiet. Mrs. Holt said nothing. Nora looked at Mrs. Garfield. "Thank you," she said. "Come back Thursday," Mrs. Garfield said, in the brisk tone of a woman moving a transaction along. "I'm expecting the salt you wanted." Nora walked out. She was halfway down the street before she let her shoulders drop from where they'd been holding, and she pulled in a slow breath of cold air and let it out and kept walking. Behind her, she couldn't know that Mrs. Garfield had turned to Mrs. Holt after the door closed and said, in a voice that carried through the whole store, "That woman has more spine than anyone I've seen walk through that door in 20 years. You might consider that before you open your mouth next time." She didn't know, but she didn't need to. She had said what was true. That was enough. Calder heard about the exchange by evening, through the particular information network of small western towns, which was efficient and comprehensive, and operated primarily through the barber and the feed store. He didn't say anything about it when she came in. He made coffee. He set a cup beside her when she sat down. He sat across from her and waited. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like you're proud of me." "I am proud of you," he said. "It wasn't heroic," she said. "It was just true." "True things are the hardest to say in a room full of people who prefer comfortable lies," he said. "I think that qualifies." She looked at him. She picked up her coffee. "Mrs. Garfield said something after I left," he said. "I heard from two separate people. I don't need to know what she said." "You might want to." "Called her, she defended you," he said simply. In front of the whole store, Nora was quiet. She looked at her cup. She thought about the woman who had told her, 3 years ago, that Beatrice Holloway had made her choices and didn't need checking on. Who had looked at Nora with that combination of pity and judgment she'd become so familiar with. Who had, apparently, been watching all this time and recalibrating in her private way and had just, today, tipped far enough to say something about it. People, Nora thought, were genuinely impossible to predict. "Good," she said finally, and she drank her coffee and she let that be enough. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, not gently, not with ceremony, but with a kind of aggressive decisiveness. The cold breaking suddenly, and the ground softening almost overnight, and the horses going restless in the paddock, with the particular energy of animals that have been patient long enough and have decided they are done with it. Maisie turned 7 in April. They had a small celebration that was the best birthday Nora had managed in years, partly because the ranch had resources that the two-room house hadn't, and partly because Calder had made inquiries in town the week before, with the focused determination of a man completing a mission. And the result was a small painted wooden horse that he had commissioned from the furniture maker on the north end of town, sized exactly for a child's hands, with a dark mane that Maisie declared made it look exactly like the dun mare in the paddock. Maisie named it Beatrice. Neither Nora nor Calder said anything about it in the moment. But later that night, when Maisie was in bed with the wooden horse on the pillow beside her, Nora stood in the kitchen and pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment and breathed through it. And Calder stood nearby and didn't try to say anything helpful, because he had learned by now that some things needed to happen in their own time, and the best thing you could do was simply be present for them. After a moment, Nora dropped her hand. "She's remarkable," she said. "She is," he agreed. "She gets that from somewhere," Nora said. He looked at her. "From you. Mostly." She looked back at him. "Mostly," she said. The word sat between them. Something offered. Something received. Not the whole thing yet, but another step toward it, one of the 100 small steps that had been accumulating since the night of the storm. Each one not decisive in itself, but building into something that had weight and substance and was starting to be impossible to misread. It was a Tuesday in May, when the kitchen garden was beginning to show green at the edges and the horses were out in the far field, and Maisie was at the schoolhouse in town, that Calder asked Nora to come outside. She came out onto the porch and found him standing with his hat in his hands, and an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not nervous exactly, because he was not a nervous man, but careful in a way that was different from his usual care. As if he were holding something that could break, and was very aware of it. "What's wrong?" she said immediately. "Nothing's wrong," he said. She looked at him. "I want to show you something," he said. He walked her to the east edge of the property, where the land ran along a creek line that marked the boundary of the ranch. She had been here before she'd walked this whole property over the winter, partly because there was always something to be assessed, and partly because walking was how she thought. He stopped near the creek. He turned to face her. "My grandfather built the main house when he and Beatrice were first married," he said. He built it in sections, started small and added on. "Beatrice told me once that every room he added was because there was someone new who needed a place in it." He looked at the land around them. "There's a section on the south side of the house that was started and never finished. He got sick before he could complete it." Nora looked at him steadily. "I'd like to finish it," Calder said. A pause. As a room, she said. As whatever it needs to be, he said. I'm not making assumptions about what it needs to be. I'm just saying the work is there. The materials can be sourced. And if there's ever a reason to have it, I'd like it to be ready. She looked at him. You're telling me about a room, she said. I'm telling you about a room, he agreed. She understood what he was actually saying, and he understood she understood, and they stood at the edge of the property in the May-peck warmth, with the creek making its small persistent sound behind them, and the complexity of the past months. Between them and the specificity of all the days ahead. Build it, she said. He looked at her. Build the room, she said. And we'll see what it needs to be. He held her gaze. Yes, ma'am, he said. And the corner of his mouth moved, and she looked away before she did something she wasn't quite ready to do, and she walked back toward the house with her hands in her coat pockets, and her heart doing something she refused to narrate. He built the room. He started it the following week, working on it in the evenings after the ranch work was done. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't ask for her opinion on every decision. But occasionally, he said things like the window's going to face east. Is that better or worse? And she said better. The morning light is more useful. And he nodded and went back to work. Maisie supervised extensively. She had opinions about the placement of the window, the height of the doorframe, and whether the room would need a second hook for coats, which she argued it would, because one hook was never enough for a family. Calder noted all of this without comment. When the frame was up, Maisie stood in the middle of it with her arms out. It's a good size, she announced. Thank you, Calder said. You should put the window higher, she said. You're right, he said, and he moved the window higher. Nora watched this from the porch and felt the particular vertigo of a woman watching her life rearrange itself around her, faster than she had sanctioned, and then thought about Beatrice's voice saying, you think they need something from you. And then find out you needed them just as much, and let the vertigo settle into something steadier. She was needed here, and she needed this. Both things were true. Both things were allowed. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks after the room was framed, that the thing happened that Nora had not anticipated, not the dramatic arrival of another Briggs, not a crisis with the ranch, not anything external at all. What happened was this. She was carrying a bucket of water from the well when the handle broke. It broke suddenly, in the way things that have been worn thin finally go completely, without warning. And the bucket hit the ground and sent water across her boots and her skirt, and she stood there for a moment looking at the broken handle in her hand, and something about the smallness and the stupidity of it hit her wrong. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she cried. Not the efficient, brief kind, the other kind. The kind that had been waiting a long time for its moment and had decided that a broken bucket handle at a Wyoming well on a Saturday morning was as good a time as any. She didn't try to stop it. She stood at the well and cried because Beatrice was dead, and because her father had stolen 7 years from her, and because she had been so tired for so long, and because Maisie was going to need new boots again by fall. Hidda said, because man at 22 with everything she had, and it had cost her so much, and she was standing on the other side of it now, at 29, and it had also given her more than she knew how to account for. And both of those things were true simultaneously, and it was exhausting to hold them. She cried until she was done. It took about 4 minutes. Then she picked up the bucket and the broken handle, and carried them to the barn, and found the tool for repairing handles, and fixed it herself, which took 12 minutes, and then she went inside and washed her face and made lunch. She had not known that Calder had come around the corner of the house, at the beginning of it, and stopped and seen her. She had not known that he had stood there for a moment, and then, without going to her, without saying her name, without doing anything at all, had turned around and gone back to what he was doing. He told her about it that evening. He said, I saw you at the well this morning. She looked up. I didn't come to you, he said. I thought about it. I decided you didn't need me to. She was quiet. Was that right? He said. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, that was right. He nodded. "How's the bucket?" "Fixed," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to what he'd been reading. She sat across from him and felt something so close to the thing she'd been holding back for months that it was almost indistinguishable from it. And she sat with it for a long time while the fire burned down and the house was quiet, and Maisie slept in the back room with the wooden horse named Beatrice on the pillow beside her. Then she said his name. He looked up. "I'm not there yet," she said. He waited. "But I'm close," she said. "And I wanted you to know that. Because you've been doing everything right for months, and I haven't told you, and it seemed like you should know." He set down what he was reading. He looked at her with those direct eyes that she had spent 7 years trying to forget and had apparently failed at, since they had recognized her immediately at 29 with the same clarity they had at 22. "All right," he said. "That's all I'm saying tonight," she said. "All right," he said again. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the specific weight she'd been carrying had redistributed itself slightly. Not gone, not solved, but shared in the way of things that you have named to someone who received the naming without making it into something other than what it was. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It came from Cheyenne, from a law office Nora didn't recognize, addressed to her specifically, not to the Holloway Ranch, not to Calder, but to Nora Whitaker, at this address, in handwriting she didn't know. She opened it at the kitchen table with Calder across from her. She read it once, then she read it again, then she set it down. "What is it?" Calder said. "My mother's family," she said. Her voice was strange. "I didn't know she had family. She died when I was 4 and my father never spoke of them. I assumed there wasn't anyone. And apparently there's a great aunt in Cheyenne who has been trying to locate me for 3 years." She looked at the letter. She saw the notice I placed about Beatrice's funeral. My name. She recognized the Whitaker name and hired a lawyer to investigate. Calder was very still. "What does she want?" he said carefully. Nora looked at the letter again. "To meet me," she said. "And Maisie." The room was quiet. "Nothing else," he said. "She says she has things that belong to my mother." Nora's voice was careful now, measured. "Letters, photographs, things my father apparently took when he married her and never returned." She set the letter flat on the table. Her hands were pressing against it as if she were holding it still. "Your father took them," Calder said. "Not a question." "He took everything that was hers," Nora said. "I grew up in a house where my mother was a name. Not a person." She stopped. "He took her from me in a different way than he took you from me. But he took things he had no right to." Calder was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you want to go to Cheyenne?" She looked up. "You could," he said. "Henderson can watch the legal matters here. The ranch will hold for a week. Maisie's out of school for the summer break." "You'd come?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "If you want me there," he said, "or I'll stay here and watch the horses and you can go on your own." "Whatever you need." She looked at the letter. She thought about a woman in Cheyenne who had been looking for her for 3 years. She thought about photographs she had never seen of a woman who had died when she was 4. She thought about what Maisie was going to look like when she saw a photograph of her grandmother for the first time, whether she'd see something of herself in it. Whether it would give her the specific root that Nora had always wanted to give her and hadn't had the material for. "Come with us," she said. He nodded. They went the following week. The great-aunt's name was Clara Marsh. She was 71 years old and small and white-haired, and had Nora's mother's eyes, which Nora discovered by looking at the photographs spread across Clara's kitchen table, and then looking at Clara's face and understanding, in a moment that hit her completely sideways, where those particular eyes had come from. Maisie pressed close to her mother's side at the table and looked at the photographs with the serious attentiveness she brought to everything. "Is that her?" she said, pointing at one. "Yes," Nora said. "She's pretty," Maisie said. "Like you." Nora put her arm around Maisie's shoulders and did not trust her voice for a moment. Clara watched this with the expression of a woman who had waited a long time for something and found it was better than she had prepared for. She was the best person I ever knew, Clara said. Your grandmother. She laughed at everything. Nothing frightened her. A pause. She would have been extraordinary with you. Maisie looked at her great-great-aunt with the careful eyes. Why didn't we know about you before? She asked. Clara glanced at Nora. Nora said, my father and my mother's family didn't get along. So we were separated. Maisie absorbed this. That was his fault, she said. It wasn't a question, Nora said. Maisie looked at Clara. We know about you now, she said simply. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite the other thing, and she reached across the table and covered Maisie's hand with her own aged one and said, yes. You certainly do. Calder sat in the corner of the room for this whole exchange and said nothing and was exactly as present as he needed to be, which was entirely, and without insertion, a warmth in the room that didn't claim anything but was there. Clara noticed him. Later, when Maisie was in the next room with the photographs, laying them out in an order that made sense to her. Clara poured coffee and set a cup in front of Calder and looked at him with the direct assessment of a woman who had been reading people for 7 decades. You're her father? She said to Calder. Yes, ma'am, he said. Clara looked at Nora. And you two are working on it, Nora said. Clara looked from one to the other. How long has it been? She said. 7 years, Nora said. How long since he came back? About 5 months, Calder said. And you're still working on it, Clara said. Yes, Nora said. Clara drank her coffee. My husband courted me for 2 years, she said. I told him on day 1 that I liked him, and then I made him prove it for 2 years before I said yes. He said it was the hardest thing he ever did. She set down her cup. He also said it was worth every single day of it. She looked at Calder. The ones worth having always make you earn it. Calder looked at Nora. Nora looked at her coffee, but she was not quite hiding a smile, and Clara saw it and said nothing about it, because she was a woman who knew when to let things be. They stayed in Cheyenne for 4 days. On the last evening, Maisie fell asleep in Clara's armchair, with a photograph of her grandmother held loosely in one hand. Nora stood in the doorway looking at her daughter, sleeping with this piece of recovered history, and felt the completeness of it settle in her, not resolution exactly, not the end of grief, but the sense of a gap being filled with something real. She had given Maisie something tonight that she hadn't been able to give her before. A face, a history, a line that ran backward in time and didn't stop at Nora, that went further and was full of people who had loved and laughed and been taken away too soon and left things behind that mattered. That was not nothing. That was enormous. On the road back to Wyoming, Maisie slept in the wagon with her coat as a pillow, and Nora sat beside Calder in the front, and they rode in the early dark with the stars very bright and the road ahead uncertain in the lamplight. After a long time, Nora said, My father thought he was protecting me. Calder was quiet. He was wrong, she said. He was wrong about almost everything. But he thought he was right, and he loved me in the only way he knew how, which was by deciding things I should have decided myself. She looked at the road. I spent a long time being angry at him. I'm tired of it now. That's not the same as forgiving him, Calder said. No, she agreed, it's not, but it's what I've got. He nodded. The horses moved steadily. The stars moved steadily, too, the slow arc of them that people who spent time outdoors learned to read like a second language. He was wrong about you, too, Nora said. Calder said nothing. You're not what he thought you were, she said. You weren't then, and you're certainly not now. She looked at her hands in her lap. He was wrong. Calder kept his eyes on the road, but she saw his hands shift on the reins. A small adjustment, something releasing slightly. Thank you, he said. It's just true, she said. Sometimes just true is the most important thing, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp swung slightly with the movement of the wagon, and the light moved across his face, and she thought about what Clara had said, the ones worth having always make you earn it, and she thought about 5 months of mornings and broken bucket. handles and jars of salve on windowsills, and a man who crouched to a child's eye level and made promises in an empty barn with no audience. She thought about what it meant to stop being afraid of the thing you already knew. "Pull over," she said. He pulled over. He looked at her. The road was empty in both directions. The stars were overhead. Behind them, Maisie slept. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at Mrs. Holt in the general store, the way she looked at everything that needed to be faced straight on, without the comfort of sideways approach. "I love you," she said. "I didn't stop. I tried to, and I was very thorough about it, and it didn't work." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying this because of Clara or the road or the night. I'm saying it because it's been true for a long time, and I've been letting you earn it, which was right, but you've earned it now. And it seemed like you should know." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then he said, I looked at him. "I've known for a while," he said. "I didn't want to say it before you did." Because you told me not to tell you things," he said. "You told me to do them. This felt like something you needed to say yourself first." She stared at him. "That was very well reasoned," she said. "I thought so," he said. She looked away for a moment. Then she looked back. "I love you," she said, again, because she found she liked the weight of it, the real weight of the words said in the air between two people, not kept inside. "I love you," he said back, not a response to an obligation. Just the truth, level and clear, the way he said everything that mattered. They sat on the stopped wagon in the Wyoming dark for another minute. Then Maisie's voice came from behind them, blurry with half-sleep. "Why are we stopped?" "We pulled over for a moment," Nora said. A pause. "Are you two talking about important things?" "Yes," Calder said. "Are you done?" "Just about," Nora said. "Good," Maisie said. "Can we go home?" Calder looked at Nora. Nora looked at him. "Yes," Nora said to both of them. "Let's go home." He clicked to the horses. They moved back onto the road. And Maisie fell back asleep, and the stars kept slow arc overhead, and Nora sat beside Calder with their shoulders touching and thought about the word home, what it had meant to her at 22. What it had meant in the worst years, what it meant now. It had meant different things. That was all right. Words were allowed to grow. They married in June. There was no announcement. Nora sent a note to Clara in Cheyenne, who wrote back with a warmth that made Nora fold the letter carefully and keep it in the tin box with the papers that mattered. The ceremony was small. Henderson witnessed it, and 2 neighbors, and Maisie, who had been informed in advance and had spent the preceding week asking operational questions about what exactly changed and what stayed the same. "Does Calder get a different name?" she asked. "No," Nora said. "Do I?" "Only if you want to." Maisie thought about this for several days. "I think I'll keep Whitaker," she said finally, "because that's Mama's name. But I could add Boone at the end." "That's called a hyphen name," Nora said. "Can I do that?" "You can do that." Maisie nodded, satisfied. "Maisie Whitaker Boone," she said, trying it. "That's a good name." "It has 4, Nora agreed. 4 is a solid number," Maisie said. Calder, from across the room, said, "I agree completely." Maisie gave him the look she reserved for when adults said the right thing. The ceremony itself was brief. Nora wore the dark blue dress she had altered herself, the same one she had altered 3 times over the years, as her weight shifted with seasons of more and less to eat. She had let the hem down and taken in the waist, and it fit her properly now, and she wore it without apology and without sentiment, because it was a good dress, and she had made it work for years, and that felt right for the occasion. Maisie carried wildflowers she had gathered that morning, presenting them with the businesslike pride of someone completing an assigned task excellently. When the minister asked Calder if he would he said yes, and meant it in the way of a man who had spent 5 months demonstrating the answer before he was asked the question. When he asked Nora, she said yes, and meant it in the way of a woman who had survived long enough to know the difference between what she wanted and what she was afraid to want, and had chosen, deliberately and without reservation, to stop treating them as the same thing. Maisie, when asked if she had anything to say, said, "I just want to mention that I've been saying this was a good idea since January." Henderson wrote it in the margin of his witness notes. Afterward, they walked back to the ranch together in the warm June afternoon. Maisie ran ahead on the road, her wildflower stems trailing from her hand, her Whitaker Boone self already entirely at home in the name. Calder and Nora walked behind her. He offered his hand. She took it, not because she needed help crossing anything, not because the ground was rough or uncertain, because she wanted to, and wanting to was enough, and she had finally, entirely, stopped requiring more justification than that. Summer settled over the ranch with the particular generosity of Wyoming summers, wide and warm and extravagant with light, in the way that places which are hard for most of the year sometimes are for the brief season when they aren't. The kitchen garden came in better than it had in years. The horses were healthy. The south room is finished in July and became Maisie's, which she decorated with her drawings and the wooden horse named Beatrice, and a piece of ribbon that Clara had sent from Cheyenne, along with a package of her own baking, and a short letter that said only, "I am glad you came. Come again." They went again in September. Clara was smaller than she had been in the spring, but brighter somehow, as if the visit had done something to the quality of her days. She and Maisie sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours going through the photographs again, and Clara told stories about each one. And Maisie wrote the names on the backs in her careful printing because she said she didn't want them to be forgotten again. Calder helped Clara with 3 things around her house that needed attention, without being asked and without making a production of it. And Clara watched him do this from the kitchen window, and then looked at Nora beside her and said, "Your father was a fool." "Yes," Nora said, "in the specific way of men who love their children too much to trust them." Nora looked out the window. "Yes," she said again. "The world is full of that kind of fool," Clara said. "It doesn't mean they're all wrong about everything." "No," Nora agreed. "Just the important things." Clara made a sound like a partial laugh. "You got there anyway," she said. "We got here," Nora said. "Same thing," Clara said. On the road home, Maisie fell asleep again in the back of the wagon she always slept on the return journey. Spent with the effort of paying close attention to everything for 4 days, and Nora sat beside Calder in the front, and the road stretched ahead in the late afternoon gold. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "I'm thinking about what I thought my life was going to be," she said. "When I was young, before any of it, and I'm thinking that what it is better," she said. "Not easier, not simpler, not what I would have planned if someone had asked me at 20 to plan it." She looked at the road. "Better. It cost a lot," she said. "It did," he agreed. "I'd do it again," she said. And then, because she was honest and precision mattered, not the losing part. Not the years, but everything I became in order to be here, I'd do it again. He looked at her. She looked back. "So would I," he said. They rode home in the early dark. Maisie woke up a mile from the ranch and immediately asked if there was anything to eat, which there was, and if the dun mare had been all right while they were gone, which she had, and if she could have a riding lesson in the morning, which she could. She climbed down from the wagon and ran through the gate ahead of them and disappeared into the house, calling about supper with the specific confidence of a child who knows exactly where she belongs. Nora stood at the gate. She looked at the ranch house with its lit window, and the barn beyond, and the land running wide and dark in every direction, and the sky enormous above it all, the way Wyoming eyes always were. Big enough to make everything underneath feel both small and exactly the right size at the same time. Calder stood beside her. She did not need to say anything. She had been a woman who walked 2 miles every day to help someone the town had forgotten. She had done for nothing. She had done it when she was tired, and when she was afraid, and when she had nothing left she wanted to spend. She had done it because it was the right thing, and because she was, at her core, a woman who did the right thing not because it came easily, but because she had decided, long before she ever arrived at this gate, that the right thing was the only thing she could live with doing. She had thought she was saving Beatrice Holloway. She had been building her way home. Every loaf of bread, every swept floor, every mile walked through cold she hadn't dressed warmly enough for. Every cup of tea brought to an old woman who had been keeping a secret she had no right to keep in doing it, Nora now understood. For the most complicated and human of reasons, because she loved the boy who had gone away, and the woman who had stayed, and the child who was the best of both of them. And she had been afraid that the truth, dropped wrong, would detonate instead of heal. She had been right to be careful. She had been wrong about some things. She had been the bridge anyway. "Come inside," Calder said. Nora took one more breath of the Wyoming night. Then she walked through her own gate, on her own land, beside the man she had loved for 7 years and spent 6 of them trying to stop loving and failed at entirely, toward the door where her daughter was already inside making noise about supper. She walked through the door. The house was warm. The fire was lit. Maisie was at the table, with the photographs of her grandmother spread out, showing them to the kitchen, as if the kitchen needed to be introduced. This was her life. She had not been given it. She had not been handed it at any point along the way by anyone who had her interests at heart. She had built it with her hands and her stubbornness and the specific endurance of a woman who refused, even in the worst of it, to become less than she was. No one would ever take it from her, not because of who stood beside her, though he would stand beside her, steady and accountable and present in all the ways that mattered. But because she had learned, through everything it had cost her to learn it, that the life you build from scratch with your own hands and your own will is the only kind that truly belongs to you. She had started with nothing. She had built everything. And inside that warm house on the Wyoming plain, surrounded by the people who were hers and who she was hers to, Nora Whitaker Boone understood that the kindness she had spent freely, the miles she had walked for nothing, the cold she had crossed without thanks, none of it had been wasted. Every step had been the way home, and she was finally fully irreversibly there.